So I like to do a lot of gardening these days, and it's always amazing to me how you get a packet of seeds and you take one seed, you put it in the ground, you water it, you get some sun, and it grows into a big plant. Well, if you think about it, all the plants, including these big trees that we see outside, all started from a seed. Well, how did all of this matter come from this tiny little seed? In other words, this is a lot of matter. It's a lot of stuff, this big tree. Where did all this stuff that makes up the tree come from? Did it come from the roots? Well, that doesn't make much sense, right? Because the ground is still there. So all the resources to make the tree couldn't have come from under the ground, maybe some of them. What is a plant? How did it get big? How did it grow? What turned it into the plant that it is today? In this video, we'll take a look and see what is the stuff that makes up the plant. Let's get started. So let's just take a moment to review photosynthesis. So we started in the last podcast looking at the light reactions, and in this one we want to go to the Calvin cycle. So the focus of today's video is about the Calvin cycle, but I do want to remind you where that fits in the overall scheme of photosynthesis. So remember, photosynthesis, here we're looking at the chloroplast. That big thing there is the chloroplast. And in the chloroplast, the light reactions occur, of course, in these thylakoid membranes. So remember, water is taken up, we water our plants, the light reactions occur, give off oxygen, right? Water was split, release oxygen. Some of the benefits of that was ATP and NADPH. So the light reactions of photosynthesis, as you remember, gave us ATP and NADPH. So what's that going to be used for? Well, that's the focus of today's video. The ATP, the NADPH, is going to be used to drive the Calvin cycle. And the Calvin cycle, of course, is going to take carbon dioxide and make sugar that will make up the plant. And of course, it will send back the NADP and the ADP to be regenerated. So the focus of today's video is on the Calvin cycle, which is taking place in the stroma, right? That's the liquid part. That's the stroma, the liquid part of the chloroplast. So this is a little complicated, so I've divided it into 3 steps, the Calvin cycle. All right, so you probably remember we just looked at the idea that the Calvin cycle starts with CO2. So starting the Calvin cycle, we're going to bring in some carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, think about it, this is a gas. All right, so we've got to take a gas from the atmosphere, we're going to take some air, basically, and put it into a cycle. So what happens is it joins the Calvin cycle, what I like to say, already in progress. So there is in the Calvin cycle already a sugar, ribulose 1,5-biphosphate. We abbreviate this RUBP. So there it is. You can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons. And what happens is this enzyme, RUBISCO, that's the enzyme, stands for ribulose biphosphate carboxylase. I'm going to go over that in a moment, give you all the details of that. But this enzyme here, perhaps the most important enzyme in the world, takes pure air, carbon dioxide, adds it to a sugar, rearranges that into these smaller 3-phosphoglycerate molecules, PGA. So the first stage is carbon fixation. We got to fix the carbon because it's a gas. We got to fix it and make it into a sugar. The enzyme RUBISCO does that by adding it to this sugar that's already in progress. Now I'm going to go over the numbers here in just a moment as we review, but I want to send you through the rest of the cycle. All right, so now we've got some of these molecules. This is 3-phosphoglycerate. You can see the phosphate is on the 3rd carbon. Stage 2 is the reduction. Remember, Leo the lion says grr. So if you're gaining electrons, you're being reduced. So what's happening here is this molecule, 3-phosphoglycerate, is going to gain some electrons and be rearranged. Notice it was we had an O there, and now we've got the H for the electron. This is G3P, also known as glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. How did we do that? Well, we actually had to use some ATP. That goes down to ADP. And we had to use some NADPH. So we used quite a bit of energy, ATP and NADPH, to get these molecules made G3P. So we've used some of this energy from the light reactions now. And the Calvin cycle, it's a cycle, it goes around, but we made one of these sugars. So this is the point where one of the sugars leaves. Right after these are made, one of these G3P molecules will leave. And that will, of course, be used to make all the other sugars that the plant needs. Glucose, cellulose, all those other polysaccharides, etc. Then we need to regenerate. So stage 3 is the regeneration of ribulose, this sugar. And so these molecules here are rearranged back into this so that it can continue the cycle. All right, so 3 stages: carbon fixation, reduction, and regeneration. Now, I told you I'd talk about the number because the number is important. It's all about the carbons. You might even say count the carbons because this will help you understand what's happening. So when the Calvin cycle starts, when CO2 comes in, we need 3 molecules of this 5 carbon sugar. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if you take 3 molecules of this, that's actually 15 carbons. 3 times 5, 15 carbons. Well, then if you take 3 carbon dioxides from the atmosphere, there's 3 carbons. Well, if you take 3 carbons plus 15 carbons, you get 18 carbons. So ribulose biphosphate carboxylase, this enzyme RUBISCO, actually takes these 3 carbons from here, these 15 carbons from here, does a lot of fancy rearranging, and we end up with 6 of these 3 phosphoglycerates. So these are 1, 2, 3 carbon sugars, 1, 2, 3. But because we have 6 of them, that's still 18 total carbons. So we didn't lose any, right? We had 15, we added 3, we got 18, it's rearranged, we've still got 18. Then the reduction stage, right? ATP and ADPH are used. We're still at 1, 2, 3 carbon, and we got 6 of these molecules, so we still got our 18. Now one of these leaves. Well, G3P, one molecule, which happens to be 3 carbons, if 3 carbons leave from our original 18, we're now down to 15 carbons. That gets rearranged, and guess what? 15 carbons again to the 1,5 or the ribulose 1,5 biphosphate. Okay, so the Calvin cycle, what do you need to know? Basically, RUBISCO is the enzyme that fixes carbon dioxide. The cycles have CO2, remember that, takes in carbon dioxide, does some rearranging into G3P. One of the G3Ps will leave each cycle so that it continue to make glucose and other things, and then regeneration of ribulose. Okay, so what's the bottom line? G3P is what leaves. This is a very important sugar because this is the end product of the Calvin cycle. We literally took air, carbon dioxide, rearranged it into this sugar. So it took, since this is a 3 carbon sugar, right? It took 3 CO2s to get the carbons to make that 3 carbon sugar. So what will this be used for? Of course, this is an energy-rich sugar. So if you take the 1, 2, 3 carbon sugars and you get 2 of those, it'll make glucose, right? So here's G3P. You put 2 of those together, you get glucose. Then you put a bunch of glucoses together or other monosaccharides, and then you can get things like cellulose or other polysaccharides. This is a 3 carbon sugar, and we actually call this C3 photosynthesis because G3P is a 3 carbon sugar. There are some other types, C4 and CAM photosynthesis. I'm not going to go into these in this video, but it just uses a different kind of sugar, or acid in this case. This is an important intermediate, as I just mentioned, because G3P is the building block, it's like the little Lego, that's used to make all the other sugars for the plant. Okay, so I mentioned RUBISCO. Perhaps the most important enzyme on our planet, definitely one of the most abundant. Why is this enzyme so important? Well, RUBISCO, which stands for ribulose biphosphate carboxylase. See, it's got the ACE, it's an enzyme. This is the enzyme that takes CO2 from the atmosphere. So it literally captures air and essentially turns it into life. Capturing the gas joins it to a sugar solid. So you remember what this enzyme does is it takes this CO2, right? It takes 3 of them, and 5 of these RUBPs, puts them together, rearranges them until we get the sugar that goes through the cycle. So very, very important enzyme. Okay, so let's do some energy accounting, and this can be a little tricky. So think about this. If CO2 is what's going into the Calvin cycle, it really takes 3 turns of that Calvin cycle to get 1 G3P, right? Because a G3P is a 3-carbon sugar, as you see there. And it would take 3 carbon dioxides to do that. So we need 3 carbon dioxides to come in to make that 3-carbon sugar, or you can think of it as 3 turns of the Calvin cycle. 6 turns of the Calvin cycle then, right, would give us glucose, a 6-carbon sugar. Because if 3 gave us a 3-carbon sugar, times 2 to get the glucose, 6-carbon sugar. And what you'll find is that those carbon dioxide, that air, is what literally turns into sugar with the help of the enzymes and that ribulose biphosphate that's already in progress. Now, it took quite a bit of ATP and NADPH to create that molecule of glucose, but it was worth it for the plant so that it could grow. Okay, so a little summary. So let's just remember, let's take it back a step. Light reactions take place first in the thylakoid membrane, right? Water is used, it's split into oxygen, the electrons get excited, go down that electron transport chain. End result, we get some ATP and NADPH. Those are what are used, as we just saw, to drive the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle took in that air from that CO2 from the atmosphere and made a sugar G3P. And then it sent back its ADP and NADP plus. So if you're going to summarize, the light reactions produced ATP, produced NADPH, good, consumed water, and produced O2 as a byproduct, right? Thank you plants. The Calvin cycle consumed CO2, produced a sugar, G3P, regenerated ADP and NADP plus, so that it can go back to the light reactions and be used again. So there's your summary of the whole reaction, just 2 parts of photosynthesis, light reactions, and Calvin cycle. Let's see now if you can summarize and answer some questions. So here's the formula for photosynthesis. It's the opposite. Right? So you take some 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 waters plus some energy from the sun, and we get some sugar and some oxygen. So here are the questions I want you to answer. Where did the CO2 come from? Where did the CO2 go? Where did the H2O come from? Where did the H2O, the water, go? Where did the ATP and NADPH come from? What is that ATP and NADPH used for? What will the glucose be used for? Where did the oxygen come from? Where will the oxygen go? So what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to pause the video, see if you can answer these questions on your own. All right, so let's take a look at these. Where did the CO2 come from? Right, from the atmosphere, and it came in through the plant's stomata, the little opening in the leaves. Where will it go? Where did it go? Remember, it went into the Calvin cycle. Cycles have CO2. Where did the water come from? Hopefully the roots of the plant. You watered, and when it was absorbed. Where did the water go? Remember, this was split in the light reactions to regenerate the chlorophyll electrons. Where did the ATP and NADPH come from? Light reactions, right? Electron transport chain of the light reactions. What's the ATP and NADPH used for? Well, of course, they're used to drive the Calvin cycle, which is ultimately to create sugar. What will the glucose be used for? Right? That's for the plant, right? For its structure, for all the parts of the plant. Where did the oxygen come from? Oh, remember that's from the splitting of water. And where will it go? hopefully out that stomata into the atmosphere for us to breathe. Okay, so hopefully that's a good summary of all the molecular parts of photosynthesis. Now I want to talk a little bit before we wrap this up about how photosynthesis evolved. So if you think about it, every process on our planet had to evolve. So where did photosynthesis come from? How did it evolve? Well, we think photosynthesis first evolved in prokaryotic organisms. Think an ancient bacteria, all right? And here we see some cyanobacteria from today, but if you think of like some ancient bacteria that started photosynthesizing. Well, if it started photosynthesizing, right, using that to make its energy, it started releasing a lot of O2. Well, the bacteria that started photosynthesizing oxygenated our atmosphere, right? So there wasn't oxygen in our atmosphere early on the planet. But when these bacteria started photosynthesizing, it filled our atmosphere with oxygen, and that allowed for other things to utilize that oxygen. So we think these prokaryotes, these ancient prokaryotes, like bacteria, right, were the foundation for modern photosynthesis, right? A lot of that machinery seems to be the same if you look at the modern cyanobacteria and modern photosynthesis in like plant cells, right? That a lot of that machinery and the process looks very similar. So we think that's where it evolved from. Okay, so a little deeper insight here to wrap this up. Think about my very first question. Think about that tree. And I said, what is the tree? Where did it come from? It started as a small seed and now it's huge, big as a house, some of them. How did that happen? Where did all the stuff, the matter to make up the tree come from? Well, hopefully this video has taught you that tree is just air. It's just carbon dioxide rearranged in the Calvin cycle by photosynthesis with the help of the sun to make the ATP and NADPH to make this tree. So what is the tree? It's really just air that's been rearranged. So if you take that a little farther, all plants then, all right, are really the same thing. So when we plant seeds to grow crops, the crops, they start as a tiny seed, and yes, they use some nutrients and water from the soil, but all of the physical matter, the stuff, the solid stuff of the plants were really just CO2 rearranged. Well, then if you think, okay, if plants are just rearrangement of air, and what do? Or cows, we eat those plants, okay? And then we as humans either eat the plants or eat the cow. You can see here with the burger. So if you take it a step further, if plants are just air rearranged by the sun, and we and other animals eat plants, then you can think of it as all plants, all animals, all people, all puppy dogs, all penguins, everything, plant and an animal, is really just strands of air, CO2, woven together by the sun.